The UFC fighter the other day, right? He won the fight, and at the end of the thing, he says,
"First of all, I love America. I love the Constitution. I love the First Amendment. I love property. And let me tell you something. If you care about your country,
read Mises's
6 lessons of the Austrian Economic School."
That's an excellent thing, because we really need to think about the world in terms of private property. Communism, the abolition of private property. The state owns everything, individuals own nothing. The opposite end of the spectrum, individualism. 0% tax rate, you keep 100% of the fruits of your labor. And when I say tax, I'm including inflation too, right? So no currency counterfeiting, no taxation, no fiat regulation. Between these two poles is socialism, an institutionalized policy of aggression against private property.
And what I believe we're entering into right now is truly the disintermediation of money and state. This is where I think things will start to become nasty.
Nothing like this has ever happened in the history of humanity. Disrupting a 5,000 plus year old technology.
I think this rabbit hole is endless. I think it continues, it just keeps going forever.
This era will be regarded as a time in which the question, what is money, was the defining question.
Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money Show. I am thrilled to have you here joining me on my mission to help shine light on the corruption of money. Now, if this is your first time listening to the What is Money Show, I strongly recommend that you go back to episodes 1 through 9 first, which lays a lot of the groundwork for many of the concepts that we explore on the show. These first 9 episodes are my series with Michael Saylor, and thousands of people have told me that this is the best podcast series they've ever heard, hands down, and that it was instrumental to their understanding of money and Bitcoin. So if you're looking to start a deep dive into the nature of money, I don't think there's any place better that you can start other than episode 1 of this show. Now, a little bit about this show and how it makes money. The What is Money Show is 100% sponsor based. So all of our revenues are derived from direct sponsorships. And I strive to be very selective about the sponsors that I work with, specifically only using sponsors that I use personally, and also choosing sponsors that have values which are well aligned to the values expressed on this show, such as freedom, education, self-sovereignty, etc. So what I'm going to do now is a few ad reads right at the top of the show, and then I'll do a few more ad reads in the middle. And I hope you'll take the time to listen to them, as again, these are hand-selected sponsors, and I think you'll like what they have to offer.
Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com.
All right, Robert, I think last time we spoke, I started the conversation with a very simple question because it is the theme of your show. And it's actually something that has resonated with me because I think it is the most important question that people have to ask in order for them to really start their journey down the rabbit hole. I think this rabbit hole is endless. I think it continues, it just keeps going forever. And I think there is no certain answer to this question. I think it evolves over time. And the question that I have for you is, what is money? How has it changed from the last time I asked you this question?
Yeah, you're exactly right that you ask yourself the question, what is Bitcoin? The obvious answer to that is Bitcoin is money. It's really nothing else. But then you get into the question, well, what is money? And that's where the rabbit hole sort of opens up, I think, for a lot of people. And it's funny because we obviously defined this word money in terms of other words, but one of the themes that I've encountered again and again on this show, and having talked to, I don't know, we've had like episode 470 at this point, so we've probably talked to, over 350 guests. Some of them have been repeat guests. One of the themes that I've repeatedly encountered is the limitations of language itself, right? The capacity of words to represent reality fully. It's obviously the best tool we've got for mapping this very complex world that we inhabit. But I think it's simultaneously, it's indispensable, right, to human communication, obviously, human rationality, cognition, all of the systems in which we cooperate and compete as the rational animal, as Aristotle called us. Language is a necessary component of that, right? There's no such thing as a business that doesn't involve language, or hardly any activity. Like it's part of our internal dialogue, right? We use language internally, even in the conversation that is ourselves. And so it's indispensable to being human, but it also seems to be simultaneously insufficient. And the language can never capture the totality of reality. And in fact, when people do think that language can, or knowledge more generally, can be totalized or totalizing, that you can capture all the complexities of reality in just propositional phrases, I think that is the hallmark of totalitarianism, right? That you actually, it's totalizing knowledge. It's the idea that you have the final solution, the final answer, the ultimate central plan that everyone just needs to follow, and this will solve all the world's problems and usher us into the utopia. And as we've seen time and time again historically, that tends to end up in its opposite, dystopian state. So trying to answer the question, what is money? I mean, I think one of the, maybe the deepest answers to it is that it's strange, right? Because when you ask a definition, right, you're thinking about this word in terms of other words. And so this mechanism actually is something that's very essential to human cognition. And I would call this, based on where I'm at today, the mechanism of metaphor itself. They're actually thinking about one thing in terms of another thing. And so I'm writing a long piece about this, but when you really, and a lot of this is based on the book Metaphors We Live By. That's Lakoff and Johnson, I think, are the authors of that. And then they've also written a book called Where Mathematics Comes From, arguing that mathematics itself is a metaphorical construct. And so the general idea is that as human beings, all we really have is our raw experience of embodied physical engagement with physical reality. Like that is our primary substrate of experience. From that experience, we can abstract that up into cognitive space, basically. So always, several words are metaphorical, several phrases are metaphorical. So for instance, the word understand, right? It's like to stand beneath something to gain a deeper perspective on that thing. So you're mapping the physical experience of standing under something to get a deeper perspective on its inner workings, right? Maybe you're under the hood of a car, or you're actually laying under the car to see how it works and repair it, right? You're not necessarily standing in that case, but you're under it, basically. And we're mapping that physical experience onto the cognitive experience of gaining a more intricate comprehension of something, right? You're understanding it in a more detailed way, basically. And so other words like, so to understand something more deeply is to get closer to the substance of the thing, which is also to sub, below, stance, to stand. There's other words like, supervision, which is like the vision up from above. So you're seeing something from multiple perspectives. And so like, do you get my point, right? Do you see what I'm saying? There's all these metaphorical phrases, words, and it's like our entire conceptual apparatus or rational apparatus is really constructed from metaphor, is the hypothesis of these individuals. And there's been a lot of work done on this since, and I think it's a pretty strong argument. So even the definition itself, right? What is money? Well, it's kind of metaphorical, right? You're thinking about one word in terms of other words. And then this gets you into kind of a circularity because, well, each word that you use to define the word money also has a definition behind it made up of other words. And so if you follow that to its ultimate conclusion, you end up in this circle of words. There's this strange thing. You can sort of see this phenomenon in action if you go to Wikipedia and they say you click the first hyperlinked word in each entry and you just keep repeating that, right? So you open up anything in Wikipedia, choose your favorite subject, click the first hyperlinked word that will take you to another entry in Wikipedia. That's what each hyperlinked word is, to another entry for that term in Wikipedia. And you repeat that process. And in something like 97% of the cases, you end up in the philosophy page. Like it always grounds out in philosophy because you get to like the bottom of language and it's like, how does language ground out into physical embodied existence? So I think, so this is something we're doing, like, so what are we doing? We're taking something that we don't understand and we're taking different aspects of it and we're analogizing it or metaphorizing it in terms of something that we do understand to gain a deeper perspective on it, to understand it better. And so with money, I think it is one of the most powerful metaphorical systems we have. Obviously, mathematics is this very universal language. I can't speak to how and why that is a metaphorical system, but I would say check out that book Where Mathematics Comes From. There's a very sophisticated argument there. But the beauty of mathematics is that it is universalizable, right? Anything that is quantifiable basically can be categorized in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So it's a universal language system or universal category system, if you will. Very useful for mapping and describing reality, right? To the point where we discover things in mathematics prior to observation, right? Einstein discovered, in quotation marks, the existence of black holes in mathematical abstract space before we ever, quote unquote, observed one. We still haven't technically observed it. We've just seen stars go around the core of a galaxy and they go so fast and they're going around one common center of gravity that we infer the existence of a black hole. You can't observe it because light doesn't escape, obviously. But Einstein, again, mathematically observed these, I don't know if observed is the right term, discovered black holes, 40, 50 years prior to our physical observation of them. So
just based on the theory.
Just based on mathematical theory.
And also, Neptune also was discovered that way, just via pure mathematics. And the reason I interrupted you is because I think that Bitcoin, there's a connection to mathematics, which you can make is the language of the universe, right?
Yes.
And the connection is via, I would say that proof of work anchors Bitcoin to the universe. It anchors Bitcoin to where we are in this this life. And I would say that is a complete and utter contradiction, the polar opposite to what fiat money represents, which is it brings all the flaws of of humanity alongside it, right? It starts morally and ethically, and then progressively over time, it starts to degrade. And it's only this only didn't just happen here in the United States. This happened in the Roman Empire as well. So it's a very kind of interesting phenomenon. Anyways, I didn't want to interrupt your thought.
Yeah. So to finish the thought on money, right, I think it's a metaphorical system because we are looking at the world, specifically the world of socioeconomic activity, right? So when people, in terms of their net worth or particular goods, businesses, right? The example I like to give is, if you're an entrepreneur and you run a business for an entire year, well, there's a great deal of complex action, interaction, buying, selling, hiring, firing, planning, executing, right? There's all of this kind of maelstrom of human action, if you will, right? By both the entrepreneur, their employees, their vendors, et cetera, all these interconnections and relations. But at the end of the day, or the end of the year rather, we just compress all of that activity into this statement, right? It's a profit and loss statement, a balance sheet, a statement of cash flows. And so this is just a mathematical data compression via money, right? The financial statements only make sense in terms of money, obviously. And so then you get this highly compressed piece of data, this artifact that tells you a lot of what you need to know about all of that business activity. And then it makes it comparable over time, right? You can look at your profit and loss statement year to year. You can also look at it across businesses. And you get this apples to apples comparisons among all of this apples to oranges activity that takes place in the actual world, right? But we compress it via money, via the metaphor of money, into a mathematical statement that is comparable and relevant to the aims of the entrepreneur, right? You need to know if you're being profitable or not, because if you're not, well, then eventually you're going to consume all your resources and you're going to be dead in the water, so to speak. So it's, in that sense, it is a measuring tool. Like money doesn't measure value per se, but it is measuring inputs and outputs in that way. And so I think what we're doing with money, to bring this to the answer, like what is money, is money is something like a tool that lets us metaphorize the complexities of human action in terms of mathematics, something that's very wet code, as Nick Szabo would say, hard to measure, hard to quantify, etc., into something that's very dry code, right? It's very, very quantifiable, algorithmic. You can perform operations on it, you can perform arithmetic, etc. And so that we need that, right? We need to convert all of this kind of messy, fluid, complex reality that we're dealing with all the time into something that is linguistic and in a common language, so we can communicate, negotiate, execute trades, etc. All of this is necessary. And then there's a feedback, right? Like the more clear your data is about yourself and your business, the more adequately you can make decisions in that messy business process that guide you towards desired outcomes, right? Profitability, business growth, acquisitions, hiring, firing, whatever it may be. And then all that activity feeds back into the financial statements. And this seems to be kind of the feedback loop of human rationality, that we have, our ideas about how the thing works, and then there's how the thing actually works, and both inform one another. And so in the same way that language is this metaphorical system for, decomplexifying, mapping the world, if you will, but it can never contain the whole thing, right? The map cannot be the territory. If the map contained every detail of the territory, it would no longer be the map, it would be the territory. And so you need to be able to kind of ignore certain aspects and emphasize other aspects to make salient the data you need to act, basically. So language is a very important tool for human action in that way, right? That I can talk to you about things. I can draw your attention to specific things with words, and then we're sharing this open source software that is English, so we can connect our minds, basically. Money's performing a similar function, but in a way in a higher signal way, and at a much larger scale, right? We're talking about coordinating entrepreneurial activities across the globe, right? And then you could get into things like the price signal, which are also denominated in money. You don't need people that are participating in the copper industry don't need to know that there was an earthquake in Chile that caused the mine to collapse that made the price go up. Like, they just need to see the number go up. And then it's like producers are incentivized to produce more, consumers are incentivized to consume less. And via this mechanism, the market rectifies the shortage of copper. So it's this, money is like this extremely powerful tool for scaling human rationality and also integrating human rationality into the material world, right? We start to think about the actual supply of goods and the demand for those goods in terms of mathematics, right? This is the price. And the price, I think, is one of the most, I think it is the primary instrument for commanding human attention in the world, right? 100%. People's net worth, the prices of assets, Bitcoin, right? What draws everyone into Bitcoin?
Number go up. Yeah.
Everyone. I mean, maybe there's a few people like, oh, I've studied the tech first and that's what made me excited. Maybe. but 99+% of people are drawn in by the price. And the price is only possible because of money. Money is only possible because of mathematics. Mathematics is only possible because of metaphor.
So you buried the lead there, which is, and I think that's the part where I really want to emphasize and I really want to talk about and explore. You just described the importance of money within the human condition, in society, how vital this is for society to run. The vast majority of people, and I'm sure that you've had a very similar experience, do not see this. They do not understand how vital how vital of a role money plays in their lives. They're completely oblivious to it. I had a conversation with my barber yesterday, and I said, you spend hours and hours and hours working to earn this money that is fundamentally corrupted. So that's the topic that I want to explore. If money is this instrumental tool that humans need in order to organize a society in a non-coercive way, what happens when that money is corrupted? What happens when you introduce fiat to the mix? I'll end it with this and I'll pass it on to you. One of the most powerful quotes that I've seen you seen you say, and it was, I believe, in McCormack's show, is that if a country has a central bank, it is already 50% communist. So what are your thoughts on that, Robert?
Yeah, so if we're going to continue with this definition of money, again, this is not the only definition of money. There's several, but it's one I'm working with lately, that it's a mathematical metaphor for human action, right? We're understanding human action and the consequences of human action in terms of mathematics. And this is a money-facilitated process. Math is obviously, as we've already said, it's a universal language, right? We all speak the Hindu-Arabic numeral system today. There was a time where that wasn't true. I went through some of that in the number zero in Bitcoin, the history of mathematics and how it developed. But ultimately, a zero-based numeral system is the most useful numeral system. You can perform calculation faster, less prone to error, and therefore it's more useful for merchants that are conducting trade, basically. So you know, in that sense, it's an open source software, right? Mathematics is an open source software. You're free to use it. Anyone's free to inspect it, modify it. You can propose changes to it even, right? You can develop new mathematical theorems. And if, you know, they are basically approved by other people, other users of mathematics, then that theorem may get incorporated into the corpus of mathematical knowledge. Most likely it will get rejected, as most proposed changes do. But it is this open source software system that is very fundamental to really everything, right? Again, in that essay, prior to the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, non-zero-based numeral systems could not support calculus, and calculus supports basically every modern science. So everything that we do in modernity requires calculus. Calculus requires zero. So math's an open source software.
Language as well, you mentioned.
English,
yeah.
Every basically natural language, another form of open source software. Now, corruption, right? This is a term we use a lot. We talk about the corruption of money. We talk about Bitcoin as incorruptible money, but we have to define corruption. What do we mean when we say this? I had a guest on here the other day who identified corruption as a lie, as a deception, fundamentally a deception. And there is some truth to that about money.
I would say it's entropy. I would say it's entropy over a long period of time. And the reason I'm saying that is from a historical perspective, empires rise and fall, right? Over time, what happened in Rome is very similar to what is happening here in the United States. And you have timeless examples over and over and over again where, you know, if you were at the height, if you lived in the height of the Roman Empire, you would have never have imagined this thing was going to collapse over time. There was entropy involved, right? There's a degradation over time. Now, I don't know if that's part of the human condition. I don't know if that's part of humanity. The very famous saying that Bitcoiners talk about, right? Strong men create good times create weak men create bad times. But I guess what I'm trying to say with all this is that is Bitcoin the uncorruptible system that we need in order for humanity not to repeat this endless cycle that I believe it's been stuck in, for a millennia, really? Is it the solution? And the reason that, and you were just describing about how important the role of money is in society. What happens if we have, to allude to your math references, what happens if we've been missing an entire part of the equation to create a non-coercive society that is efficient? What if we've been missing that equation? What if we have not been able to solve it until Bitcoin was discovered?
Yeah. To start with the point on entropy, right? Entropy is basically disorder. It's chaos, right? It's a thermodynamic concept for uncertainty, chaos, unpredictability. The opposite of that is negentropy, right? Which is basically signal, right? It's orderliness, it's information. And so money's interesting because the degree to which money and the money supply are predictable, the more it can communicate about the uncertainties of economic activity, right? We have no idea what businesses people are going to start, how much supply of anything they're going to sell, how much consumer demand will shift, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. The future is uncertain, right? It is inherently uncertain. It's irreducibly uncertain. Now, what we need to do is gather information about that uncertainty. As the horizon of the future is oncoming, we need to gather information about that and disseminate it as efficiently as possible. To the degree that there is uncertainty in the money itself, right? That the money itself is uncertain. We don't know the supply. We don't know who owns what. Even in fiat world, we don't have one money, right? We have regional monopolies on currency. There's all of this arbitrariness introduced into this communications channel that is supposed to convey the resolution of uncertainty as we're doing it, right? As human action is dealing with uncertainty, we need to convey the consequences of that activity. But if there's uncertainty in the channel, right, then you have noise introduced where there's supposed to be signal, right? So you get an increased noise to signal ratio, and that's not good, right? That's detrimental to the ability of money to communicate about the consequences of human activity of dealing with uncertainty. And so to take it back to corruption, it's the etymology of the word, it's related to the word rupture, which is like the failure of an internal organ, right? If there's a rupture, an organ's supposed to carry blood or information or whatever the substance is from one organ to another. And if there's a rupture of the vein, for instance, right, well, the blood can't flow from A to B. So there's information loss, there's vitality loss, etc. And it's injurious to the organism, obviously, right? If you have a ruptured vein, well, you need to get that taken care of or you're going to be in big trouble. So the arbitrariness that tends to get introduced to money is this human element of control, right? That this is an instrument of power in a very literal sense, right? There's purchasing power, which is what money contains. Purchasing power affords political power, right? With purchasing power, you can hire soldiers, you can lobby, you can rewrite laws, you can actually change socioeconomic reality with purchasing power. So you can buy political power with purchasing power. And therefore, there's a lot of physical power that goes into the acquisition of purchasing power, whether that is actual production, right? We're producing goods and services via physical power, or could be confiscation, right? Armies go to war over money. They go to war to establish monopolies of money, etc. So the corruption element is something like the definition that I think is very useful is it is a set of unevenly applied rules, right? In an ideal situation, we're all participants and players in the same game according to one common rule set that no one can change, right? This is a principle we really derive from the laws of physics, right? And Jason Lowery would go into this and say, well, yeah, this is the fundamental game we're playing, as we're playing within the bounds of physics. No one can change the laws of physics. Therefore, we all just play by them. And ideally, we would have a money or even a rule of law that exhibited a similar integrity to the laws of physics. What this would do is it would induce people to play by the rules of that game, right? They would conform their actions to the rules of that game because the possibility of changing the rules does not exist, basically. In combat, in armed combat, for instance, we do this, right? We play by the rules of the laws of physics, but you could imagine this world where maybe we discovered some ability to manipulate the laws of physics. That would become the ultimate weapon of war. Everyone would fight over that particular apparatus, because if you could change the rules of the laws of physics, that is the power to win every war that will ever come in perpetuity, right? You just turn off gravity. You, I don't know, explode oxygen, right? You could just literally manipulate the laws of physics. You could change the equation of force equals mass times acceleration. You could totally just obliterate any opponent because you could wipe out the game board on which they're playing. So that is kind of a thought experiment about what we're doing in fiat world, right? That the rules are not fixed, and there is a power, there's a rule-making authority, which is, I would call, generalized to the central bank. It's an institution that cannot lose because they actually print themselves new units of money to extract purchasing power from the savers in that currency. That is equivalent to changing the rules of the game, right? There's an implicit agreement that people sacrifice labor, energy, and time to obtain the money. And there's an implicit expectation that that money can be later redeemed for similar sacrifices from others. But if there's an institution that can counterfeit the currency, well, then they can siphon purchasing power out of that money without performing any work, right? That's an asymmetry of rules. That is rules for thee, citizens, not for me, the central bank. Therefore, it's an asymmetric mechanism for extracting wealth and basically perpetrating theft. And so what does that do to society? Well, you are rewarding, in that case, non-productive political action, deception, even warfare, right? You need deception and warfare to maintain the authority to own that rule-making apparatus that everyone else is forced to play by. And there's also a big incentive to keep people ignorant about the nature of money and how the system works. I myself have a master's degree in accounting and finance. I'm not saying that to name drop or brag. I say that because I wasn't taught anything about the nature of money, nothing about Austrian economics, not one peep, not one sentence, not one word. That tells you something, right? Like it was a top 12, my school's like number 12 in the country for accounting and finance, like one of the best top programs in the country. You don't learn anything about how money works.
And that's on purpose.
It has to be. What else could it be? I mean, how could you have a curriculum on accounting and finance and you get a master's degree, which is the highest degree you can get next to a PhD?
Yeah.
I don't think they teach you anything in PhD about Austrian economics either. I know a few people have gone through the program. How else could that be? But they would not teach you the most fundamental thing.
You know what? It reminds me of, and I'm sure you saw this, it went pretty viral on Twitter, the commencement speech.
Yeah,
where
the Bitcoin mention.
They mentioned Bitcoin, and you have all these college students, right, have agreed to go hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, and they're booing this thing, where Bitcoin can help them tremendously.
The farm at Okefenokee is a revolutionary new regenerative agricultural community. It features an 8,000 tree olive orchard, which they use to make their own olive oil, as well as a very large pecan orchard. All the animals on the farm are heritage animals, with some varieties over 100 years old and others thousands of years old. Fresh eggs are produced daily by the farm's chickens. Also, there are over 1,000 beehives that pollinate the over 200 heirloom fruits and vegetables and provide honey to all the residents. The farm makes its own molasses, unrefined sugar, herbs, and spices. The farm also features an herbal apothecary and a commercial kitchen. These are just a few reasons why the farm is the healthiest place on earth. To learn more about the healthiest place on earth, go to okefarm.com and use discount code BREEDLOVE for $21,000 off custom cabin pricing. Again, to learn more about the farm at Okefenokee, go to okefarm.com and be sure to tell them I sent you. Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE.
Now, but I kind of want to double back to the reason I use the word entropy and the reason, because the way that you described it, chaos, right? But I think it starts with order, right? In the case of Rome, right, I believe their currency was called the denarius. It started with a certain silver percentage, and it was quite high. Over time, it degraded. Over time, you know, they were coin clipping, so to speak. And you could make the very same case here in the United States in the case of the Federal Reserve, 1913. You know, it was backed by gold. Supposedly, they broke that promise, the 6102 order, then, you know, the Nixon shock, all of that stuff. So it's almost as if human beings have a tendency, if they have the capability, to degrade the system. And it might come from a place of good, you know, the road to hell is paved in good intentions, right?
Sure.
It might come from a place of goodwill, but over time it has severe unintended consequences, which leads us to where we are now, which I believe is, you know, a lot of people call it late stage capitalism. That's BS.
Of course.
This is late stage fiat.
Yeah.
The tragedy of all this, Robert, that I see though, is a lot of these people, I would say the masses, and this is actually something that worries me. And it's actually a perfect segue to the next part of the conversation is the vast majority of people, as you saw with that, you know, the commencement speech, the boo from the audience, and just my interactions with people around me, people that I went to high school with, they are still asleep to that question, what is money?
Yeah.
They work, you know, they spend their entire lives working for this. They, you know, do whatever it takes. But they're not interested in knowing
what it is.
What it is. Just like you just said that you got a master's degree in something that you would think would teach you about what this thing is. So what can we do as Bitcoiners to really break this echo chamber, to really move this Overton window to the point that people really do start asking the question, what is money? Because I believe if we do not get to that point, we are already entering into the political sphere.
Yeah.
Right? Where you have candidates like the leading Republican candidate Donald Trump mentioning he's anti-CBDC. Of course, you have RFK Jr., who's taking an anti-CBDC, pro-Bitcoin stance. I believe the next 5 to 10 years, really, this is going to be a very contentious issue in the United States. Not to mention all the hostility coming out of the current administration, the proposed 30% tax on Bitcoin miners, the FinCEN proposals, the legislation that's currently in the Senate introduced by Elizabeth Warren that has 20 senators that would be a de facto ban on Bitcoin mining in the United States. Not my words, Pierre Richard's words. So like clearly we're entering into the political discussion where rubber meets the road. And now it gets to the point where we essentially have to convince or wake enough people up in the population to the reality that the money's broken, the reality that the money's not working for them. And they're getting completely distracted by the whole left-right narrative, the whole Democrat versus Republican, which I call the divide and conquer strategy. So what can we do, Robert? What can we do to accelerate that?
Well, I mean, first I would say it's probably best to just be humble, right? That we can do our part. We can beat the drum. We can shout from the hilltops. We can educate, right, as many of us try to do. And I do think all of these things that you've said, like we're witnessing the fact that I'm increasingly convinced of, and I feel very fortunate to have stumbled upon this as the namesake of the show, but I do think this era will be regarded as a time in which the question, what is money, was the defining question.
100%.
There's a pinned tweet on my Twitter about this, short 3-minute clip, many different people talking about this, arguing about this. Everyone's trying to define it everyone's talking their own book, right? What suits them best, including us Bitcoiners, by the way. But we're also talking about something that suits humanity best. That's the difference.
I'll stop you right there.
We're advocating for money that no one can counterfeit ever, right? So yes, it's beneficial to us to figure this out first, and that we benefit in anticipation of later adoption, but it does not put us in a position to bend, twist, or break that rule set. So we're moving into the ultimate moral and technological high ground in Bitcoin, and that is the incorruptible position to be in. Whereas other people, like Trump, for instance, he's pro-dollar. Why is he pro-dollar? Because that's a corruptible rule set, right? He can control that. He can externalize inflation. He can print more money to wage war, et cetera, et cetera. So
the central bankers are going to say exactly what you just said, right? Which is, we know our system is superior. We know our system is the best.
Yeah, but what they're not going to say is that our system is not one in which you cannot counterfeit currency. They'll never say that. They won't call it that. They'll say inflation, and they'll say, inflation's healthy and necessary for a continued economy. But the reality is, as I've said many times, inflation is legal. Counterfeiting is criminal inflation. There's no substantive economic difference whatsoever. There's just a legal distinction, which is inherently corrupt because there are rules for thee, not for me, right? The Fed can counterfeit by the trillion. You or I do it, we go to jail, right? That is fundamentally corrupt. That's a bifurcated rule set. That is apartheid in an economic sense. It's a two-tiered legal system, right? We are recognized by the legal system in a different way than central bank shareholders. They can print money, externalize the cost, and benefit. You or I do it, we go to jail, right? So it's fundamentally at odds with the principle of Western civilization that says we are intended to be equal in front of the eyes of the law. That's not true in the case of central banking. It is a legal monopoly. So the question was, what can we do about this? Well, for better or worse, this is another theme we hit on the show often. And this pertains to entropy as well, right? Pain is information, right? So it is much more cost effective to learn through the pain of others, to learn from the mistakes of others. This is why it's so useful to be a student of history, right? If you study the history of money, you'll see how all of these fiat currency experiments end, and you can preempt the coming end to the current fiat currency experiment. You can learn about how inflation works, where it ends up, all the problems, the attendant problems that come with it, like more urge to gamble, more risk taking in the economy, more scamming in the economy, gender fluidity even in the Weimar Republic. Like, I don't exactly know the connection there, but for some reason there was a lot of gender fluidity going on. At the same time, they were counterfeiting currency like crazy. Is that a direct linkage? I'm not sure, but obviously we're seeing it today. At the same time, we're counterfeiting currency like crazy. So that's one way to learn, right? Be a student, study, learn through the pain of others, much more cost effective because you don't have to incur the pain yourself. But the more likely scenario for most people, being the hard-headed, forgetful animal that we are, is that we have to learn through our own pain typically, right? People booing at that commencement speech, those kids have never experienced the pain of broken money, right? These are kids in was it an Ivy League institution? What was it?
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, okay, so
they're a top college.
Literally grew up in the ivory tower.
Yeah.
Right. They've had the proverbial silver spoon up their ass their whole life. Money has always worked. They've never been locked out of a bank account. They've never suffered capital controls. They've never seen a hyperinflation. They've probably never opened a history book about all of these things because, again, it's not taught in college at all. Like at all, it was zero. Even when you specialize in that subject, as I said. So these kids have no idea, right? They've never felt the pain. They've never felt the entropy of broken money and what it can do, or really the entropy of state oppression more generally, right? Like in China, you cannot take out more than, I think, $50,000 a year. The capital controls are that tight, right? Which is not much at all, right? If the government is getting excessively oppressive, you can't even cast a vote of no confidence by moving your purchasing power offshore. You don't have that option available to you. Again, that's corruption, right? There's rules that are applied to citizens to keep them locked in. I'm sure those rules don't apply to the bureaucrats inside the CCP that probably, have carte blanche to do what they want. So this touching of the proverbial hot stove, right? The feeling of the pain, the experience of the entropy is the source of information for most people that don't want to do the work of studying the painful experiences of others. And even if you study the painful experiences of others, it's not as visceral as going through your own pain, right? Like I don't think you can. It's hard to obtain or cultivate wisdom through the reading about the pain of others. But if you go through painful experiences yourself, you can bet your ass you're going to gain some wisdom from it. So this is the experienced pain of going through hyperinflation, whatever it may be, where you're experiencing the problems that Bitcoin actually solves directly in your life. This is what will cause you to put yourself into a new formation, physically, economically, cognitively, right? As you relate to and understand the world. So when I say pain is in formation, it is literally the phenomenon that puts you in new formation. And if you actually look at the etymology of the word pain, it comes from something like the price paid. Funny enough. So it is like actually you pay a price, not necessarily a monetary price, but something that you valued was taken from you or lost or destroyed by virtue of this experience. And that is what we call pain. And pain is this is fundamental to life, right? It's almost like the inarguable basis of being itself. If you're suffering, it doesn't matter what propositions you have or what arguments you make. Like the pain is so real, it is overwhelming. And that's why I think it tears apart. You might be anti-Bitcoin today. Then all of a sudden, if the currency starts to hyperinflate, or if your bank account gets frozen, or you're subjected to capital controls, or whatever the thing is, that pain is going to tear apart your previous worldview and force you to put it into a new formation that says, oh shit, actually this thing is helping me circumvent whatever problem I'm dealing with. Then you'll see the value of Bitcoin and you'll start, down this journey into the rabbit hole, most likely. So there's all of that taking place. So what can we do? I mean, we can continue to educate, but you also have to be humble and accept that this is how people work in general. Like they tend to have to go through the pain first. And then the last point I want to get to was because you asked about communism, right?
Yes.
And so
it's your line specifically.
yeah, and these definitions matter a lot, right? Because the isms, especially, I see people talking past one another so frequently.
All right, let's individualism, collectivism, because that's really what it is.
So yes, you're right. The reality is there's individualism and everything else is collectivism. And I think collectivism is too nice of a term. I would like to call it individualism, which is the respect for life, liberty, and property, and coercivism. Everything else is a violation of life, liberty, or property. However, we have to kind of meet the audience where the audience is. So we can't say individualism, coercivism, because that excludes the terminology they are familiar with, like fascism, communism, socialism, even democracy, right? So I really like Hoppe's definitions for these terms. And on one end of the spectrum, you have communism, right? And Marx defined this himself, actually, that if you could sum up communism in one sentence, it was the abolition of private property. And this gets to your question too about like, what can we do as Bitcoiners is like, I think taking the education to the deepest, most fundamental place and mounting really strong rational arguments. The people that do choose to learn through the pain of others, these are the arguments that will win them over ultimately, I think. I mean, because the people that are doing the work and seeking truth, when you build an argument on like an unassailable foundation, this is your best hope for helping other people see the truth that you feel that you've seen. I don't want to be presumptuous and say that we found the truth, but I think many Bitcoiners have come to a common conclusion that is centered on the truth of private property, the importance of private property. We even saw the UFC fighter the other day, right? He won the fight, and at the end of the thing, he says, "I fucking love private property. You know, read Mises's 6 lessons." Like, it's the Overton window's shifting, right? This abstract notion of private property is coming into popular parlance and conversation. I think that's an excellent thing because we really need to think about the world in terms of private property. And this is what Hoppe does, right? Communism, the abolition of private property. The state owns everything. Individuals own nothing, right? It's pure coercivism. So that's one end of the spectrum. The opposite end of the spectrum, capitalism or individualism, right? Universalized respect for private property and the possibility of consensual transfers of titles to private property by contract. So individuals own everything and they can trade with one another consensually, right? There is no non-consensual exchange. There's no stealing. It's all, do you agree? Do I agree? We both agree, then we can trade, right? Then we're maximizing value creation because only at the point that you value what you're receiving more than what you're giving up, and I do the reverse, I value more what I'm receiving more than what I'm giving up, that we both enter into a consensual trade. So we both leave the trade psychologically better off than we otherwise would have been. So value has been created on both sides of the transaction by virtue of consent. Only possible in a world that honors life, liberty, and property, in a world of individualism or capitalism, right? So those are the two ends of the spectrum. Communism, state owns everything, you own nothing. Individualism, individuals own everything, state is next to non-existent. In this world, by the way, government only exists to preserve life, liberty, and property. Nothing else, right? No health care, no fucking social safety nets, it's just all of that is justifications for theft. The preservation of life, liberty, property is the exclusive philosophical scope of government. Anything beyond that, I think, is just a scam. Between these two poles is socialism, which Hoppe defined as an institutionalized policy of aggression against private property. So you could think about this as what is the average effective tax rate of citizens in that country, right? If it's 30%, well, then they're 30% socialist, right? Which is they're 30% on the way away from capitalism towards communism, right? Communism is like 100% tax rate. You keep none of the fruits of your labor. Individualism or capitalism, 0% tax rate. You keep 100% of the fruits of your labor. And when I say tax, I'm including inflation too, right? So no currency counterfeiting, no taxation, no fiat regulation, which gets a little tricky to quantify because inflation is actually impossible to quantify because it's as subjective as the values of the person doing the buying. But that notwithstanding, this is the spectrum, essentially. And so the quote that you cited of mine was that in a world that is run by central banks, and you consider that the money can be printed at any time, no democratic process, it is just literally arbitrarily, we don't even know actually the criteria. We don't know. There's something like 7 governors of the Federal Reserve. We know who they are, but we don't know who the shareholders are. You don't really know who owns the bank. If you don't know who owns the bank, you don't really know who runs the bank. These are closed door meetings, so we don't know the criteria by which they're deciding when to print money. We don't know even the dividend that they're receiving for the printing of money. We don't know the seigniorage, which is like the difference in the face value of the production and the cost of actual production. We don't know how much they're stealing on that. And we don't know how many US dollars are in existence. We don't know how many will come into existence. We don't know how many are going out of existence. We get data published, but it's changing all the time. It can't be audited. The Fed's never been audited. So it's just a black box, basically, right? It's just totally opaque, corrupt nonsense. And I tweeted this the other day. The Fed is trust me, bro. Basically. And Bitcoin is trust math. So it's like that's the dichotomy, essentially. So if money is 1/2 of every transaction, and money can be printed arbitrarily at any time for any reason to violate the private property of savers, then the money itself is inherently socialistic, right? Socialism is built directly into the money because it can aggress against the private property of savers at any time for any reason without any explanation or justification whatsoever. So if money is 1/2 of every transaction, then out of the gate, you are at best 50% socialist, right? The money can even be deauthorized, by the way. They don't even need to print it. We saw like India did with a 500 rupee banknote. They just turn it off overnight. They just say, this is no longer a bill. They just beep, it's off. The central bank can do that with anything. So you think you've got cash under the mattress in your safe, you're a fucking fool. Not only can they inflate it, but they can also just turn it off. Or they can just suspend physical cash. And they just say, we don't take physical bills anymore. So out of the gate, you're 50% socialist if 1/2 of every transaction is money, and that money is designed to steal from you, basically. So when you hear people talk about late stage capitalism, it's nonsense. We can't possibly be more than 50% capitalist because the money is 100% socialist, and it's 1/2 of every trade. So, and the reality is obviously once you monopolize money in that way, other industries close to the money spigot start to become more socialized, right? Healthcare, insurance, banking. These are not free market institutions, right? These are areas, specifically in finance, where we have too big to fail. Too big to fail is not capitalist. Too big to fail says the political power has decided that stolen proceeds will be funneled into these organizations to keep them alive, no matter the level of economic losses they produce. Whereas a purely capitalistic world would say, if it's producing losses, then that's a signal that the capital inside of that organization or organizations can be put to higher and better use elsewhere. So we're interrupting the adaptive signal of the market economy itself by politicizing and socializing the money in this way. And so we're not in late stage capitalism, we're in late stage central banking, which is another way of saying late stage monetary socialism. So for the people that really want to understand all of this shit, the best metaphor to compress it down into is look at it in terms of private property. This is the most fundamental this is the essence, this is the unifying principle of civilization itself. All you want to know is that you can go into the world, delay your gratification, earn more than you spend, and save that residual in something that can't be compromised or stolen, right? That you have a relationship between the assets you create that cannot be violated. This is the essence of civilization. This is why we don't have to kill each other over every sandwich, right? We can handle disputes non-violently via the rule of law or via a bid-ask process in the marketplace, and we can allocate scarce resources in a peaceful way via private property. When you start to violate the principle of private property, you go into the domain of force and violence. And this is the situation, right? So if you want people to really understand this, you have to build your arguments on the foundation, the unshakable foundation of private property, and look at things in the world in terms of private property. Is this reinforcing private property? Is this attacking private property? And that is justice. That is the essence of justice. If justice is people getting what they deserve or not getting what they don't deserve, private property is people keeping what they earn and not getting what they didn't earn. This is the essence of justice itself. So if you want to understand how the world needs to be organized, you have to look at it through the lens of private property. It is the only way to understand what's actually going on.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's interesting too, and shout out to you, Svetsky and Mark Moss about this, right? It was Karl Marx that originally wrote that basically the necessity of a central bank in order for communism to even
Measure
exist.
number 5 in the 1848 Manifesto to the Communist Party said the state needs a central monopoly on cash and credit to perpetrate Marxism, basically.
100%.
Of course it does. How else are you going to abolish private property if you don't monopolize the currency?
100%. And I also, another component is in that whole type of, what was the term that you said? I love that term. I'm going to start using it. Instead of collectivism, you called
coercivism.
it coercivism.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't think that political ideology, that political way of thinking is possible without effective redistribution mechanisms. So we have direct taxation.
That's right.
But the most insidious one is taxation via inflation, which people are just not aware of for whatever reason. If you get rid of just the inflation component, they're in trouble. Like it's
half their revenue.
I don't know how they're going to be offering these free things. I don't know how they're going to be able to buy those votes.
Stolen things.
Correct.
Yes.
I don't know how they're going to be able to offer those stolen things to someone else in order to remain in power. So it's a very interesting subject. And I kind of want to go back, and you buried the lead there. And I think it's a very interesting topic, Robert, because I've seen this happen. I've seen this happen within myself. I've seen this happen within my family. And the topic that you brought up in regards to the Weimar Republic in Germany and how they were kind of going down this, they were, exploring gender fluidity. And I would make the case that that is a further example of just the degradation of society. And now where I'm trying to connect the dots, and I think they do exist, is that I think that the further money gets disconnected from reality, I think it brings people along with it.
Yeah.
I think that if people are not aware that the only way to really create value is to create a business, of course, but there's a proof of work component to it. Like you can't just create money out of thin air. I think that if you have the ability to do that and people believe in that, it's almost, and this is perhaps too deep, but it's almost as if it corrupts the soul.
Yeah.
And what I've seen with people is that they get closer to, and I don't know what your spiritual beliefs, Robert, are, but I'm a Christian, right? I've seen people get closer to God as they've adopted a sound money standard. And I've seen people get farther away from, the spiritual component, the more they believe in this fiat, system. I think there's something there. I've seen this pattern. I've been in the space for 8 years now, and it's something that I'm seeing over and over and over and over again. And I'll leave it with this final thought. I don't think it's a coincidence that the country that first made Bitcoin legal tender, therefore fixing the incentive structure of society, is the country with the most popular president in the Americas. I do not think that's a coincidence. I think they're connected.
Yeah, it is incredible, right? To see Bitcoiners. I mean, the common pattern is something like, and it's not just buying Bitcoin, when I say Bitcoiner, this doesn't mean someone who bought Bitcoin. This means people that are assiduously, purposefully going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, right? Trying to learn about the world around them, how it is broken, how Bitcoin fixes these things, and then incorporating those principles that Bitcoin instantiates into their own life, right? Proof of work, radical honesty, self-sovereignty, even radical transparency, which is related to radical truth, but is not exactly the same. I think these are the people that I would call Bitcoiners. And it's something that I'm striving for in my own life. Like, I think if you really take it seriously, Bitcoin can make you a better person.
Why?
This is the strangest question of them all. I don't know exactly why.
That's why I asked you about the spiritual component.
Okay, so the definition of spirit that I like most, I think this is Heidegger, but maybe someone could check me on it. The I that is in we and the we that is in I. So we talked earlier about language, right? That it's this indispensable yet insufficient mapping tool for dealing with reality. Well, reality is continuous, right? It is, we are interconnected right now, right? We're breathing the same air, right? We're speaking the same language. We're using the same light, right? Everything is connected to everything else, right? Chaos theory has captured this as well, right? The butterfly flaps its wings in Japan and creates a hurricane in Florida, right? That everything, complex systems are absolutely and totally interconnected in a way that is beyond comprehension in a way, right? No one can see the butterfly flapping its wings and make an observation and tell you in advance there's going to be a hurricane in Florida. The initial conditions, small changes in the initial conditions can have giant outsized impact on outcomes, right? Because there's a non-linear connection between these systems. But this is the nature of complex systems themselves. So when we talk about the spiritual domain, I think that's what those words are intended to emphasize, right? The I that is in we and the we that is in I. We know this about human maturity as well, that children mature by internalizing representations of other people. So that the 2-year-old, for instance, might just recklessly go into the cookie jar, but maybe the 4-year-old has sufficiently internalized the representation of their mother that says, hey, you can't just go in the cookie jar, you need to ask permission, whatever the thing is, and they can start to have that conversation internally, right? Or at least that avatar of their mother is kind of, the angel on their shoulder telling them not to go into the cookie jar. And we would, from the outside, look at that child and say, oh, that child is more mature than the 2-year-old that just can't help but abandon themselves to their carnal desires to eat the cookies, right? So that is the process of maturity, actually. As we internalize more accurate and robust representations of other people around us, we become more mature individually. So the more we, that is an I, the more mature and spiritually developed we become. And then in turn, we step into our individual role in history, right? We realize that history is not some abstract flow of events which we are regarding separately. We are an active participant in this game, in this flow of events that is human history. And then the I starts to step more into the we, right? And this seems to be something like the essence of spirituality, right? So it's not this, oftentimes when people say the word spirituality, they think, oh, I'm praying to some abstract domain, hoping I get into heaven, or maybe I'm trying to tap into some other world, supernatural thing. But I don't think it's that at all. I think it's this actually infinitely continuous, fluid, complex reality that we inhabit. And it's deeply psychological. It's also procedural, perspectival. There's all these different levels of knowing that Vervaeke highlights. And language is something like, language is not that, basically, right? Language is, instead of being continuous and fluid, language is relatively discrete, right? We have little boxes of meaning and we try to arrange them in different ways to adapt it to describe the different contours of reality, but it's limited in its ability to do so. So I say all this to set up, okay, why is Bitcoin spiritual? Why is it invoking spiritual change in people? and it's a very difficult question to answer, but it's something like, it begs the question to me of how, because we ourselves are also complex adaptive systems, right? Just the individual organism, in addition to participating in the complex adaptive systems of the global economy, the global climate, right? Like everything we do, like we're participating in that ecosystem, or those ecosystems, if you will. And so it begs the question to me, how much are we integrated to both, these systems, right? Like economic systems, which is another way of maybe saying, like, how much are the pathways of individual character and moral development influenced by the incentive systems they inhabit? This is one area I think that Bitcoiners would agree strongly on, that incentives really matter, and they really shape who we are, and they really determine the shape of society and the way societies operate. It also kind of begs the question, to what extent are human beings core operating components of Bitcoin itself? So as you plug into Bitcoin, not just buying it and holding it, but really start to study it and try to live out the principles. As you start to study Bitcoin, we conjecture where it's going to go, right? Towards this world of the sovereign individual, less nation statism, less coercivism, more individualism. Well, then in that act of extrapolating where things are going, we start to try and embody that in the present, right? Because, this is where I want to go. This is what I want to go towards. You start to enact that life. And when you start to enact that life, it seems like it takes you towards traditional value systems. And a lot of those are captured in things like Christianity, but not just Christianity, right? Like you could also be Buddhist, you could also be Islamic. I mean, these older religions that have a lot of, let's say, Lindy principles for living well with your fellow man, right? And living moral lives. They seem to contain a lot of the lessons that Bitcoiners are kind of rediscovering by becoming adherents to the principles that Bitcoin embodies. So I don't exactly know the causal mechanism, but it is the common pattern with people is Bitcoiners start to identify, they take inventory of their lives and they say, okay, I do these few things good. And maybe this is something like it's humbling, right? When you lower your time preference, right? You start to step out of yourself. You look at yourself in context of a larger whole, right? The whole of human history. Again, how humans are influenced by incentives. So you start to get more of an objective lens on yourself to some extent. And then you start to take an honest inventory. Like, okay, well, here's some things I'm good at. Here's some areas of my life that are going well. Here's some other areas of my life that aren't so good, that I think there's room for improvement. And then the theme is people just start working on that, right? They start, okay, I'm not in good shape, or I don't have a good community church practice, whatever the thing is, or I'm not eating well, or I don't like my job. I want to go start this business. And people just start like marking those things out that they don't like. And they start adding to the list about the things of themselves they do like. So somehow Bitcoin encourages you as this sound savings instrument to just become more serious about self-development. Is that a product of just the freedom that Bitcoin is affording you by virtue of giving people more purchasing power and economic liberty? Maybe, but there's a lot of rich people in the world that aren't doing this, right? There's plenty of people with plenty of financial freedom that aren't following this same pattern. So what is it about Bitcoiners? Why are they having more kids? Why are they getting in shape? Why are they going back to church? Why are they, adopting ancestral diets? And again, it's something very interesting to think about. I don't have the bright answer for it, but it is probably the most fascinating aspect of Bitcoin, especially at a time where people like Elon Musk are trying to sound the alarm about population decline. It's like, people aren't having enough babies. This is going to be the biggest issue we ever face in the next few decades, sounding the alarm. And then, obviously there's this big trend worldwide where people they call them John Vervaeke calls them the nuns. I think that people just they profess no religious affiliation or belief whatsoever, right? They're either agnostic or atheistic, basically. Yet you see Bitcoiners kind of going the other way, and I don't know. It's really fascinating. And then for me personally, like, I don't call myself a Christian because that comes with a lot of maybe expectations that I don't think I'm ready to accept or live up to. But for me, one of the areas I've gotten into by studying Bitcoin is this area of mimetic desire by reading the book by Rene Girard. And the essence is that, humans are very imitative creatures. And so this is why we're the product of our environments. This is why we become like the 5 people we spend the most time with. This is why we're so incentive responsive. Like we're very, human nature is very fluid. And so for me, holding out the figure of Christ as a role model, holding out the figure of Socrates as a role model, and just studying these individuals, reading about how they lived and trying to emulate or imitate, trying to internalize them, right? I'm trying to create that avatar of the inner Christ or the inner Socrates so that when I face situations in the world, I can try to look at it through their eyes, right? What I know about them, how would they deal with this situation? And that's a way that I've learned or am learning or am trying to learn to try and cultivate my own wisdom and develop myself in a less foolish way, basically, right? And so I don't know that I wouldn't say that Bitcoin's taken me to God necessarily. I talk a lot about God on the show, but I'm not preaching to people. I'm not coming at it from a purely Christian standpoint. I think the word God is probably the most loaded word in the world.
It's like, what is money?
Yeah, well, and there's big words, right? So it's like, what is truth? What is beauty? What is justice? What is goodness? What is freedom, right? These are all gigantic words. They're very fundamental, but when you try to dig into them, I mean, there's just tomes of philosophy books written about these things, arguing about what they are. And at the pinnacle of that list is the word God. And so for me, it represents something like the word for all that is beyond words, which is most of reality, by the way. It's also the word. So if it's for everything that's beyond words, it is that domain that's unknowable, right? Knowledge cannot capture it. And in that way, as we said earlier, the belief that knowledge can capture and contain everything is totalitarianism. I think that's the reason having a philosophical conception of God is a bulwark against totalitarianism. You have this reverence and respect for the reality that is beyond propositional capture, right? And you understand that language is indispensable yet insufficient, right? It cannot be totalizing. And that's a very important concept to internalize. Also, as the place of the unknown, it's what all creativity depends on, right? So all creation depends on. All of creation is authored by God in this sense. This doesn't mean there's a guy in the sky writing a book that determines your life. Just this principle of that which is beyond propositional knowing is the source of all creation, right? Anytime you create a new business or a new person or do anything novel whatsoever, well, it was unknown before you did it, right? So it came from the unknown. And so, but it's also the force by which things are known, right? And this is where you get into the Neoplatonic tradition, which talked about, you could look at the work of Plotinus. He called it the one. And this is the kind of like the metaphysical basis of all being. So it's not what is known, but it's the way by which things are known. So he says something like, just like the eye does not see light, but sees by way of light, so the mind cannot see the one. We cannot propositionally capture it, but the mind sees by the way of the one. So it is the actual mechanism through which we have the ability to know things or to understand things. And so when you combine all of these things together about God, like it's that which is beyond words, which is a lot. It's the essence of all creativity. It's the essence that we participate in as creators, right? As we create things, this is the spark of divinity or God within all of us. These are all philosophical notions to me. I'm not here. People say crazy shit to me, and like, I'm happy for them. So we're like, hey, thank you. I love your work. Thanks to your work, I was able to discover Christ, and now I'm like a born again Christian. And I'm like, wow. Like, I'm very happy for you, but I'm not intending to do that. I'm not trying to witness to anyone. I love Jordan Peterson's answer to this when they ask him, do you believe in God? And he says, no, but I act as if he exists. And the fact that he's putting the primacy on human action rather than human proposition or belief. I often say that I don't believe in belief. If you belief is just this set of propositions that you claim to have. Like, I don't think that matters. What matters to me is how you act. I don't care if you're Buddhist, Christian, like whatever your religion you profess. Do you honor life, liberty, and property? Do you put human freedom and love and truth at the pinnacle of your value system? Then we're good. We're good. Whatever God you believe in, whatever philosophy you want to embody, as long as you honor and respect your fellow humans, then I think that is the way, so to speak.
Absolutely. And I think Bitcoin brings that out in people.
Yeah, it energizes it.
It does. And
I'd like to thank my friends at Swan Bitcoin for their long-standing support of the What is Money show. Swan's mission is to help millions of people get into Bitcoin, so they built the best solution to set up recurring Bitcoin buys and automatic withdrawals into cold storage. With the Swan app, it takes just 2 minutes to sign up and start buying Bitcoin. If you're a new customer, you get $10 in free Bitcoin for signing up, and the first $10,000 of Bitcoin you buy incurs 0 fees. If you're an existing Swan customer, then the next $10,000 of Bitcoin you buy now incurs 0 fees. So if you love to recommend Bitcoin to friends and family, then Swan is the best place to start. So go to swanbitcoin.com/breedlove to get started today. Again, that's swanbitcoin.com/breedlove. Are you sick of being robbed by politicians through inflation and endless money printing? If so, you need to be at Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville, Tennessee on July 25th through 27th. As the largest Bitcoin and Fintech conference in the world, Bitcoin 2024 stands as a beacon of monetary freedom, a glimmer of hope amongst a darkening macroeconomic backdrop. Top speakers, companies, and thought leaders from across the industry will convene in Nashville to look ahead to the next year and beyond. I will be there, and Bitcoin conferences like this have become my favorite place to socialize since becoming a Bitcoiner. Ticket prices will increase soon. Get your tickets now and secure your spot at this game-changing event. So go to b.tc/conference and use discount code BREEDLOVE to sign up for the Bitcoin 2024 conference. Again, that's b.tc/conference, discount code BREEDLOVE.
I would say perhaps maybe it's the act of self-custody, and then that leads to the rabbit hole of self-reliance. I think if you have fiat in a bank account, right, it removes the element of personal responsibility. Mm-hmm. The idea that you can write down a 12 to 24 word seed phrase and you can store your entire life, I'm going to call it energy, within that, right? There's an element of responsibility there where before you were outsourcing that. And perhaps maybe that is the mindset shift of people. And then they start to feel empowered in the sense that, like, I don't want healthcare from, not only do I not want healthcare from the state, they do it horrifically. They do it horribly. Yeah. So is it the self-reliance element, perhaps?
Certainly makes you grow up, right?
Yes.
I mean, yeah, self-reliance is a good framing for the difference between being an adolescent or a child and being a full-grown adult, right? You're relying on your parents when you're a juvenile to a greater or lesser extent at different points in your life. Even after you fly the nest and you go to college, you start your early job, many people still, what's the old joke, like, oh, they come home on the weekends with their laundry, Mom, do my laundry. Like, you're still relying on your family. obviously this is a generality, not everyone's like this, but the extent to which you become self-reliant is the extent to which you become a mature, fully grown adult. Okay? If that's true, then the radical self-reliance that we take by self-custodying Bitcoin stands to reason, I think, that might be another step in the process of growing up, right? You reduce your dependency on the state. You take on more self-responsibility. And in doing so, you become more of a sovereign individual, right? You gain the ability to act as you see fit without dependence on others. And the language is tricky here because we're all dependent on one another to some extent. But Bitcoin at least gives you the capacity to be more selective about who you're dependent on, right? Instead of just being dependent on some abstract nanny state to hopefully send you a social security check or pay for your health care or whatever the thing is you're depending on them for, you can reduce reliance on this abstract institutional other, and you can start establishing more dependence on those that you actually know, love, or trust in your immediate circle, right? Or not even know or love, like just people you want to work with, right? Instead of getting state-paid healthcare, you can go and select actual healthcare providers, and you decide, oh, this is the guy. I've vetted 3-5 guys, women. This is the one I like. This is the one I'm going to work with. This is the one I'm going to give my energy to. Not I'm going to have my economic energy stolen from me by the state, and then they're going to tell me what options I get, and I get to pick whatever they chose for me, right? There's an abdication of responsibility in that process that Bitcoin lets you reclaim. So, yeah, maybe it is I don't think it's as simple as that, but that's definitely another way to look at it, is that, the truth is that individuals are self-owned, self-controlling entities, right? And this is fundamental to the libertarian argument that ultimately people act, right? People control themselves. They choose means to pursue ends. And Bitcoin acknowledges and honors that reality, that by letting people control the fruits of their actions over time, right? And making them resistant to the coercive actions of others, whether those others be criminals or institutionalized criminals, the state or the central bank. And so that's empowering, right? This is why that word sovereignty is so important. It's where we get the word reign, R-E-I-G-N, like when hope I spelled that right, like when a king reigns over his people, right? This idea of having political authority over others. Well, this Bitcoin lets you have political authority over yourself. And it creates this new incentive system where individuals have political authority over themselves. And by virtue of having political authority only over yourself, then you can really only engage with these other self-sovereign actors in terms of consent, because coercion becomes a less profitable strategy for dealing with people in a world where people can preserve their purchasing power in an unconfiscatable medium. That's a beautiful thing, right? That means more peace. Means more productivity, prosperity, means higher standards of living, more political freedom, more trade, more innovation, more options, less war, less criminality. I mean, all of these things that we want, Bitcoin seems to be a gateway to that world. And, hence the oft repeated mantra in Bitcoin, fix the money, fix the world. Yeah. And it, again, begs that question, back to money. It's like, to what extent money's not just a technology, it's not just a social construct, it's kind of like a little bit of both, right? It typically has a physical instantiation, but it also has this sort of software linguistic element. So to what extent are we components of monetary networks? That might explain why there's so much positive feedback when we move on to an ethical monetary standard, that we become more ethical creatures. One of my favorite quotes is that human nature is like water. It takes the shape of its container. I think those containers are incentive systems, basically. Whatever we pour human nature into in terms of the incentive schema that's how we start to act, right? We see people respond to incentives, basically. And Bitcoin is a radically new incentive schema that energizes ethical action, right? It's promoting and incentivizing respect for life, liberty, and property. And I don't know that there's ever been anything like that, right? We've had constitutions which sort of outline the rights individuals have and what governments can't do. And here are the penalties if the government violates those things. Okay, great. We write this all down on a sheet of paper. We try to adhere to it. But there's never been this economic engine driving that action. You know, it's just always been an agreement. And it's worked pretty well, like probably as good as a sheet of paper can. But Bitcoin is a new format of that technology, and it seems to give us a lot more material incentive motivation for adopting these ethical principles and universalizing respect for life, liberty, and property. And that's why it's such a big deal for the human race.
Absolutely. It's the first, and you hit the nail on the head. It's truly the first incentive structure that is aligned.
Yes.
And you don't see that, right? A miner pursuing profit benefits everyone else. A node operator, because they don't want to trust someone else's copy of the blockchain, benefits everyone else.
Yeah.
You and me, right? Making content in different ways. But what are we doing, right?
Yeah.
We're pursuing our own incentives.
Exactly.
And in the process, what are we doing? We're furthering, we're furthering Bitcoin, and we're furthering the separation of money and state.
And then when you extrapolate that to a world that runs on a Bitcoin standard, you will actually start to root for everyone's economic success.
Yes.
Because every time someone builds a business that advances the productivity of the human race, your savings purchasing power just went up.
Absolutely.
So there's an incentive change. Like, I don't want to go to war or steal your stuff or do this. Like, you actually want people, there'll still be competition in business, peaceful competition, but violent competition becomes much less attractive, because that would actually decrement productivity, which is going to decrement my purchasing power. So to get everyone on a common saving standard where each economic success story increases my savings, like you're talking about the ultimate alignment of the self-interested motivations of entrepreneurs and the selfless motivation of, the greater good, world peace, productivity, harmony, etc.
Absolutely. 100%. And you see this too, because it's so interesting that the hostility that you've seen come out of the IMF and the World Bank, which they tout that they want to help these developing countries, and their vitriol reaction towards El Salvador. One of the conditions that they gave Argentina to give them another loan was that they had to de-incentivize the adoption of Bitcoin within the country. Exposes their incentives, right?
Sure.
Were they really about, bettering these countries, right?
Yeah.
Or were they corrupted, by the fiat system itself? Now, I think, Robert, we're entering into a moment in history where we're there at the movie. Like we're at that point in the movie where Bitcoin is entering into the political sphere and the political discussion. And I truly believe that in, the next couple of years, this is something that is going to be not only talked about, but it's going to become a major electoral issue. We saw a little bit of it with Vivek, with RFK, with Ron DeSantis. They all mentioned it. Saw a tiny little bit with Trump. We definitely are seeing it with Biden in terms of his stance towards the industry and his hostility towards the industry. So I guess my question to you is, how do you see the geopolitical landscape in the next coming years? And I really want to kind of include the sovereign individual thesis into this. And I love that book. I think I've read it like 5 times, where he's talking about the United States being one of the worst countries to potentially set up shop, because they're going to be one of the countries that are going to fight tooth and nail to protect their ability to create money for free that everyone else has to work for. And you're already starting to see little inklings of that. So what do I mean by that? First, you had the Roger Ver. I'm not exactly a fan of Roger Ver, the whole Bitcoin Cash thing that happened, but his arrest in Spain after he gave up his citizenship, and the U.S. government said, look, you owe us an exit tax. In Canada, they just announced that they're thinking about doubling the exit tax and doubling the penalties. Like the psychology of that, we're talking about theft, right? Has been a major theme of our conversation, is absolutely insane. So, you know, I'm a just became a father, you know, 3 or 4 months ago. I know you are a father yourself. So this is definitely something that I know you've thought about. I've put a tremendous amount of thought into it. I think we do believe that the sovereign individual thesis will play out, but what keeps me up at night is the transition. And I think we are in the first inklings of that transition. I think we have been seeing the great disintermediation of information with peer-to-peer mass communication, like podcasts. And, you know, it's not the biggest broadcasters in the world right now are Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson. They're not on legacy media. I'm sure you saw the interview with Mike Benz and Tucker, basically saying that the government was not prepared for social media. It completely hampered their ability to control their narrative on a massive scale. And what I believe we're entering into right now is truly the disintermediation of money and state. But unlike the disintermediation of information and state, we are now going after their source of power, right? And this is where I think things will start to become nasty. So, what's your take on the geopolitical landscape? Where do you see all of this going in the next 5-10 years?
I'm always very hesitant to make predictions, especially on given timescales, because nothing like this has ever happened in the history of humanity. We've never had a monetary asset emerge that is disrupting. We've never had a technology emerge, so far as I'm aware. We're 15 years into Bitcoin. It's disrupting a 5,000 plus year old technology, gold. So far as I'm aware, we've never had anything at that scale, right? Something emerging this quickly that is disrupting something that ancient. And the entire world, this is another thing, this dawning realization you get by going into the Bitcoin rabbit hole, is you come to understand how the entire global order is built on top of and around gold, basically, right? Whatever country has the most gold is the global superpower, right? At the conclusion of World War II, the fact that most of the gold ended up in North America, I think that was the tipping point that brought the U.S. into World War II to finish it and declare itself victorious. And then the first thing we do after World War II is hold the Bretton Woods Conference to rewrite the global banking order, in which the dollar is pegged to gold, all other currencies are pegged to the dollar, giving us the exorbitant privilege to print money ad infinitum, basically. Obviously, it was checked by gold, but in 1971, we removed that check and we could externalize inflation, right? The world sends us goods and services. We send them pieces of paper we can print. Basically putting the U.S. on top of the game, right? That we get to be, and this is what, I mean, every superpower has basically always tried to monopolize the currency in this way. So it's not like something new. It's again, just a testament to the fact that money is power. Well, that's been kind of the way it's gone, right? You had the Dutch, world power, they had a currency. There was also, there was more use of the gold standard in that time because we didn't have the electronic age, right? So it was much more difficult to implement and operate a global fiat standard. Then you had the British, and I think it was Isaac Newton that actually put the world onto a gold standard effectively by putting Britain onto a gold standard and then forced the rest of the world to adapt. And gold was the best money. And then obviously in the wake of the British Empire, we now have the US Empire that was also dollar-based, gold-backed currency that then became a fiat currency in 1971. And that's what we're living through now, is kind of the decline of the US Empire. That is probably being accelerated by Bitcoin. Again, in the lens of the sovereign individual thesis, books written in 1997 predicted the emergence of social media, predicted the emergence of anonymous digital cyber cash, I think is what they called it. And it basically said once people realized that they could opt into a non-predatory monetary policy, right? You could opt into money that doesn't steal from you, that there would eventually be an awakening, a gradual then sudden awakening, that people would stampede into that money so they could stop getting robbed by inflation. And the numbers are berserk, right? If you start looking at, there's a table somewhere in that book, or maybe it was just written in the book and I made a table out of it. But if you talk about, reducing your inflation rate at 10% per year over a period of, I want to say 20, maybe it was 40 years, and you're looking at earnings of like 10,000 or 100, I forget the exact numbers, but I'm going to guess. Someone have to check me. I think it's $100,000 of earnings per year. If you could shield it 10% from taxation or inflation and you could compound that for 40 years, it ends up being like a $44 million decision. So it's not like, oh, I'm trying to, skirt inflation and save a few bucks. It's like, no, this is tens of millions of dollars over a lifetime of earnings. If you can opt out of predatory money and opt into predation resistant money, which is Bitcoin. So the thesis of the book is saying this calculus is just too, like, you can't, there's an osmotic pressure, basically. No one's ever forced into Bitcoin, but any rational economic actor that wakes up to this reality, especially as inflation gets worse, they have more of an incentive to figure out what they can do to avoid it. They'll basically be, osmotically pressured into Bitcoin. And so what does that do? Well, then you have people in an uninflatable currency, holding a lot of purchasing power in an uninflatable currency. And this would then sunset or eliminate inflation as a revenue option for the state. Now in 2020, the revenue mix of the US government was roughly 50-50. We printed roughly 4+ trillion, I think it was more like 6, and we collected via taxation, direct explicit taxation in the neighborhood of 4 trillion. So you could say inflation was, to be conservative, call it 50% of revenue, when direct taxation was 50% of revenue. Granted, that was somewhat of an anomalous year because we printed a bunch of money, but also I would say the U.S. tends to be less dependent on inflation for revenue than other states because we have we externalize a lot of that inflation, so we don't need to print as much money to get as much juice, whereas other states actually need to print more money and they collect less in taxes. So if inflation goes away as a revenue option, that's basically half of the U.S. government's revenues. Okay, if you cut a business's revenues in half, what happens to the business? Business tends to get cut in half, right? Yeah. So this is what the sovereign individual talks about, that the monetization and emergence of Bitcoin would shrink the state over time. And if you run this all the way forward, their thesis is we move from a world of 200 nation states to one of maybe 20,000 free city states, right? People have a lot of options and you get a lot more experimentation at the governance layer. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You've read the book 5 times, but I'm just kind of running through it for the audience. What does that mean for the years ahead? This is a staggering, colossal transition.
It completely changes the relationship between the individual and the state. 100%.
Yes.
It is radical.
Yes.
What you mentioned it earlier, this has never happened in human history.
No.
And it's crazy. And I guess the comparison, Robert, would be the separation of church and state. Yeah. And the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars that were after it. But it's not a very it's a different, and you could actually make the statement that was the beginning of the nation state.
Yeah.
In that era. So I guess that would be a comparison, but it's not a comparison.
I actually like the Protestant Reformation as somewhat of a comparison.
Why
because,
is that?
Well, after the invention of the printing press, the medieval church lost its monopoly on book production via the scriptorium. and this broke its monopoly on knowledge, basically, right? So then books went from being a luxury item to something that anyone could afford. And with that, people developed higher degrees of literacy and numeracy, and they became smarter, basically. And so the church had depended on kind of being this gateway between people and knowledge, or people and God. And then once bookmaking became widespread and cheap, well, then people started to become more intelligent. This was a precursor to the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Age. Was really this cognitive software update. Like, people were becoming more literate, more numerate. And so the Protestant, eventually Luther pins the 95 Theses on the church, and it starts this whole Protestant Reformation. And that leads to the decline of the medieval church as the dominant institution in the world, and paves the way for the nation state, which paradoxically, the printing press that brought down the church, the same printing press that ultimately enables arbitrary expansion of the money supply, which expands the nation state, especially in times of war. So one of those weird ironies of history through the lens of technology. And, in the Reformation, there was a counter-Reformation, right? The church fought back. The church tried to cling on to the vestiges of power that it still had, and it was quite brutal. It was quite a dark time. So obviously, no one hopes for that. Bitcoiners don't hope for that. It would be great to see this smooth transition that some people have proposed, that maybe we just start, really the US is a great place for this, because we had a decentralized constitutional republic when we were founded. Bitcoin is like the most American technology in that sense in human history, right?
Absolutely.
It's like, if we were still anywhere near our founding principles, we'd be embracing this thing with both arms. But we have, I would argue, due to the central bank, we have radically overgrown centralized government and gotten far away from our decentralized founding principles, such that, you have Elizabeth Warrens of the world or whatever decrying Bitcoin. Whereas if we had any real Americans, we had an Andrew Jackson in office, he would be like, finally, something to put these den of vipers in their cage, right? And so maybe we can rediscover our founding principles and embrace Bitcoin. Again, you mentioned RFK. There is this incentive, right, for politicians to start caring about what their constituencies care about. So the more Americans that are holding Bitcoin and the more Bitcoin is appreciating, well, that preference gets expressed into the political layer via the Electoral College. So maybe, but on the other hand, the United States does have the most to lose in this whole thing, because they sit atop the heap of the global fiat paradigm. So how does it play out? I have no idea. How could I honestly sit here and give you some kind of play-by-play for how this is going to play out? I would be very fucking arrogant to do that. It's like, no, that, again, we're like pulling threads of these historical events, but even those aren't the same, right? Like, the printing press is not incorruptible money. Taking away the monopoly on knowledge is not the same as taking away the monopoly on money, right? These are different goods, if you will. So the best thing I can flail about over here and try and offer you or anyone, and something that I'm trying to incorporate into my own life, is summarized in the maxim that in times of great uncertainty, the optimal strategy is optionality, right? So you want to develop as wide and as rich of a set of options for yourself as possible, right? We don't know. Is the United States going to become dystopian, totalitarian nightmare? Is the EU? Is China? You don't know where these things are going to happen. So obviously, Bitcoin gives you a great degree of optionality in that you have purchasing power independent of the state. You have world money. You can take that anywhere, do a lot of things with it. Purchasing power outside the system, as someone like George Gammon would say. Doesn't have to be Bitcoin. Could be physical gold. can be cash under your mattress, although that's not entirely out of the system. As I said earlier, right? They can deauthorize cash, they can inflate cash. Gold is okay, but obviously much bulkier than Bitcoin, and it's physical, so you can't get as much purchasing power into less space, basically. And in my opinion, Bitcoin is like the best tool for that job in terms of moving purchasing power across jurisdictional boundaries without interference. But other options you want to develop, right, I like the idea of having an alternative place of living, right? I'm working with a place, it's at the Florida-Georgia line called the Farm at Okefenokee. And they have a totally off-grid living situation, right? They have their own water, their own power, their own food, their own livestock. They're building a church, they're building a school, they're building a blacksmith, like everything you need to live completely independently, right? So if the whole world goes to shit, well, then I have this sort of bug out location and plan, call it a citadel, if you will, that you can go be amongst like-minded people. There's a lot of Bitcoiners there, of course, because that's a huge selling point for Bitcoiners. And that's a good option, right? That's a great option. If things get dicey in Miami, where we're at today, or, civilized US cities in general, well, then I can go kind of live off grid. And I think there's a lot of, that option value could be tremendous in times of great strife. Other forms of optionality include firearms, right? You need to protect yourself. You obviously need ammunition for firearms, food supplies, water, multiple passports, right? Multiple residency cards. You can also, when you start getting into that game, you get into multi-flag theory. You can optimize yourself from a tax standpoint, right? You can, spend a certain amount of time in certain places of the world, and you can kind of jump through these little loopholes to optimize yourself from a tax liability standpoint. Well, when you optimize yourself from a tax liability standpoint, obviously you save money, you can compound your resources more year over year, you create more and more financial options for yourself, especially if you're saving some of that in Bitcoin, which further compounds your purchasing power over time. So, and then, relationships, obviously, right? You need to know people that can do different things, and community is very important, not just in your immediate physical proximity, but also people online, and, owning private businesses, multiple revenue streams is another area of optionality. I think that's really useful. And you just have to build robustness, or ideally anti-fragility into your life, so that if things do get bad, that you don't, not only would you not suffer, but you could even gain, right? If you've positioned yourself intelligently. There's that old saying that the best fishing is in troubled waters. I think it was Bank of America was founded in the streets of San Francisco after the Great Fire, right? The guy sitting there literally among the ashes started making loans, and he's built that into Bank of America. I'm not suggesting start a bank, but that's just kind of one illustration of how in times of chaos, there's great opportunity, right? Being greedy when others are fearful, and fearful when others are greedy, this whole thing. So I don't want to say all this to invoke fear. If anything, it can be opportunity, right? That, yeah, sure, we're going through a great transition. We're transitioning from the industrial age into the digital age. All of the institutional realities that have been built up on top of a pseudo gold standard that we still live on, even though we individually don't transact in gold, you bet your ass nation states transact in gold, right? They're not taking paper in settlement of war debts. So gold makes the world go round still till this day. If that technology is being disrupted, all the institutions built on top of it are also subject to disruption and change. I don't think anyone can tell you what that looks like, right? You're just going to it's going to be a lot of change, a lot of uncertainty. Therefore, let's focus on optionality. And if you do that right, then you could really come out of the other side of this transition, not only, having survived, but having thrived. So, I hope that's helpful. It's not, I don't have
It absolutely
specific
is.
prescriptions, but
It absolutely
Options.
It absolutely is. I think it's definitely helpful, and it's definitely helpful in the sense of it helps people really truly become a sovereign individual, which is, I think, Bitcoin gives you the tool to do that.
Yeah.
But it's not the only tool.
That's right.
Optionality is incredibly important.
Yeah.
Now, Robert, we were talking about earlier on in the conversation, we were talking about the importance of number go up, in the sense of that is one of the biggest converters, right? You know, we always hear the saying, you come for the money, but you stay for the revolution, right? One of the themes that I hear from a lot of people is they buy into the unit bias of Bitcoin. They see it, I don't know what it's at, it's around 60K, I'm assuming, at the time of this recording, and they say, I missed the train. So my question to you is there still an opportunity for someone to adopt a Bitcoin standard? If they see Bitcoin today, are they still going to benefit in contrast to someone who adopted Bitcoin 5 years ago?
Yeah, so unit bias is a real thing, and it is unfortunate. Maybe there was an opportunity at some point to standardize in sats instead, but then again, I don't think that works because each sat is worth, how much is a sat worth today? I don't know, sub penny, obviously. So it gets difficult to talk about that. You almost need to talk about, groupings of sats, I don't know, and then you're in some type of, kilosat, 1,000 sats or whatever the thing is. But yeah, it's amazing how many people just think, it's been happening the whole time, right? Like when Bitcoin was at 60 cents, they're like, oh, it'll never go to $6. And then it goes to $6. It'll never go to $60. It goes to $60. It'll never go to 600. 600. It'll never go to 6,000. It'll never go to 60,000. Like it's the same cognitive fallacy or bias on repeat. And it has to do with this framing, like you're looking at the world through dollars, and something about your mind can't imagine this asset being worth a certain amount of dollars, right? But you're looking at it incorrectly, right? Because that doesn't matter. It's really, the 21 million was arbitrary ultimately, right? Could have been 210 Bitcoin, right? And then each one would be worth $1 bazillion each, or it could have been 2.1 quadrillion Bitcoin, and then it would be worth a lot less. Like the unit, it's just how many slices of pizza, right? How many slices you're slicing that pizza into. But what you really need to do is look at the size of the actual pizza, which is the market capitalization itself, right? And so what is the market capitalization today? What is the total addressable market? Like what market is it competing in, and what is the total addressable market is competing for? That's also an open question, right? Because it's like, well, how much of the market cap of real estate and equities and even bonds, how much of it is monetary premium, right? The fact that currency is not holding value over time, therefore people that are looking for purchasing power preservation sell the currency and buy the thing that can't be counterfeited, right? It's very hard to ascertain what that is, right? You know it's there, right? You can see, like in equities, it's a little bit more visible because you'll see historic multiples, like say, oh, this sector is typically trading at a 29 times earnings multiple, right? And now all of a sudden, post 1971, those multiples are averaging 39, 49 times, whatever it may be, depending on the sector. That gives you an indication, right? That, oh, this was there was still counterfeiting occurring, but not at the rate that is occurring now. This is like pre 1971 Nixon shock multiple, and then there's the post. So you could infer that the multiple over 29 would be something like monetary premium, and less than that would be the actual reservation demand for the equity itself. More difficult to do in real estate, unless it's commercial real estate, because you get some of those multiples. But if it's just residential, I don't think you get as much of that. So yeah, I think that. I'm sorry. What's the original question?
TLDR, are people late to Bitcoin?
Are people late? Yeah. So the unit bias thing, just looking at the total addressable market, however you circumscribe that, right? On the low end, you could say Bitcoin's competing for just money, right? So just the reservation demand for currency as it exists today, global M2, somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 trillion, maybe 140. I would say that's the low end for the total addressable market that Bitcoin is competing for. If someone thought that was too ambitious, they might say, oh no, it's only competing for gold. Okay, well, gold's 14 to 16 trillion market cap, right? So let's say on the extreme low end, 14 trillion, medium, midway, I'd say about 120 to 140 trillion. That's global M2. And then on the high end, you start considering the monetary premia that are in other asset classes like real estate, equities, bonds. And again, hard to ascertain what that is, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 to $250 trillion. Okay. Again, all of this is sort of disregarding Bitcoin's unit bias because we're looking at it in terms of market cap rather than individual Bitcoin price in terms of dollars. Well, Bitcoin today is what? 1.5, 1.7?
1.25.
1.25 trillion. Okay, there you go.
Boom.
There's your upside, right? So if you think it's going to gold, well, 14 divided by 1.25. If you think it's going to global M2, 140 divided by 1.25. If you think it's going to 250 trillion, 250 divided by 1.25, that gives you the upside multiple that remains in Bitcoin. Obviously, there's a degree of subjectivity throughout. I also don't, as much as we talk about Bitcoin, as much as I am a Bitcoin advocate, I don't like to tell people you should buy Bitcoin because I actually don't believe that. I think you should study Bitcoin and you should study the nature of money and you should decide for yourself. Because if you don't understand what you own, then you're going to get shaken out of that position. Like, it's just not going to work for you. Trust me. Like, if you have things in your portfolio that you don't understand, at least somewhat, like the position sizing really should reflect your level of understanding. Otherwise, you're not going to be comfortable with it, right? Like if the price movements are giving you emotional perturbation, then you got a problem. Not just with Bitcoin, but any asset, right? If you're in too much in Nvidia, whatever the thing is, if you don't have a conviction in that company and what it's doing and the product market fit and the team and global macro conditions, et cetera, if you don't have a deep conviction in that is, or at least let's say a conviction that is commensurate with your portfolio sizing, then you are improperly allocated. So the ultimately what I think is best for people, again, I could be wrong about this, is that your portfolio construction should reflect your understanding of the world, right? Like I understand these assets. That's why I own them, right? I've studied these things. I think they're undervalued or I think they're going to do well in the years ahead for whatever reason, right? Based on your outlook on the world. Well, that portfolio construction, that understanding should be reflected in your portfolio construction. And for me, as someone that's studied, money and Bitcoin for a long time, I feel great. Actually, I've never felt better. I've owned a lot of weird things and I've had a very extremely varied portfolio constructions in the past, owning a little bit of a lot of different things, and it consumes your mind a lot and you have to study and, blah, blah, blah. But now it's like mostly just Bitcoin, some private businesses, dollars, like things that are, in my opinion, very low risk. I actually think dollars are the highest risk position in my portfolio. Funny enough, because they're held with banking custodians that I can't trust. So that's it. Yeah, unit bias is totally a cognitive fallacy. Like it's a failure to understand. And then, the worst is when you hear people talk about like, I'm not going to buy Bitcoin because it's $60,000, but I'm going to buy XRP because it's 60 cents or whatever. And you just like want to beat your head against the table because it doesn't make any sense, right? It's not the size of the slice of the pizza. It's the size of the pizza and how big that pizza is competing to become, not about how many slices you slice it into, right? So yeah, it's a tough one. I see a lot of people fall for it. Even quote unquote smart money falls for this unit bias. And I think it's a testament to how deeply integrated the dollar delusion is into our minds, right? That people aren't using the right mathematical metaphor to interpret the world. So I hope people will look at things in terms of market cap and private property. I think those would be good mechanisms of clarity.
Absolutely. Robert, well, this was our second conversation. And like always, I completely enjoyed it. It's been an honor, and hope to see you, hope to have another one with you in the future.
Yeah, man, this was really great. Thanks for coming to the house and doing it with me.
Appreciate it. Beautiful place you have.
Thank you so much.